So last week's Parsha, we started the story of Avraham Avinu, and we continue this week. Vayeira Elav Hashem be'Elohnei Mamrei, v'hu yoshev Pesach u'oyel kechoim hayoim. And in the very first psukim in this week's Parsha, we learn about the importance of mitzvah sheben odam lechaveiroi, the mesiras nefesh of Avraham Avinu in the mitzvah of Hachnasas Orchim, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu coming to be Mekayim, the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. So this story is two fundamentals in mitzvah sheben odam lechaveiroi. One, we learn from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it is not something we really understand, because we understand nothing about the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but Chazal teach us, as Rashi brings, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to be Mekayim, the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. And Avraham Avinu is busy, not with Kabbalas Pnei Ashchina, but with the mitzvah of Hachnasas Orchim v'yoretz l'klosam. And the Gemara, based on this story, says, Godel Hachnasas Orchim yoseh mekabbalas Pnei Ashchina, because Kodesh Baruch Hu comes to visit Avraham Avinu, and Avraham Avinu apologizes, and he says, Anu tava mi'alav decho, Rabbi Yisrael, could you wait a few minutes, because I'm busy with something very important, and I am oisik in Hachnasas Orchim. So we will speak about Bikur Cholim and then about Hachnasas Orchim. And Bikur Cholim and Hachnasas Orchim fundamentally are two sides of the same coin. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to do Bikur Cholim. Where is the source of the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim? In Chazal we find a few different sources. In Soit Daf Yud Daled Omed Aleph. Achrei Hashem Elokechem telechun. V'chi efshar laleches acharov, alo Hashem Elokechu eish oicha lehu. He is fire. Elo halech bidrochav. And what are his drochim? Mahu malbish harumim, af'ato halbish harumim. Ma'ahu mevakeh choilem, af'ato mevakeh choilem. Kodesh Baruch Hu is Menachem Avelim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Koiveh Mesim. He buried Moshe Rabbeinu. So you do the same. So this posek, Achrei Hashem Elokechem Telechem, teaches us the importance of mitzvah sheben odam lechaveiroi. And Chazal give 4 examples. And the 4 examples are lahalbish arumim. That is not a specifically clearly defined mitzvah. It's just chesed. It's a form of tzedakah. Mevakeh choilem, menachem avelem, koiveh mesim. Why these 4? It's just maybe a matter of coincidence. We find these 4 that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was engaged, kiviyochel, but the principle is the basic principle of gemilus chasodim. Baba Metzia, Lamed Amid Beis, which is somewhat an interesting drosha. Vohidat olhem es derech melech yelech bo. Yelech is Bikur Cholim. Derech is Bikur Cholim. Yelech is other mitzvah sheben odam lechaveiroi, which is an interesting drosha. Nadoram lamet esem beis. Ufkudas kol odam boy, that is Bikur Cholim. So we find different sources in Shas, remez leBikur Cholim. However, the most important source is the Rambam in Perek Yudalad of Hilchas Ovel, and the Rambam writes that all the mitzvahs that are defined and called by Chazal Gemilas Chasodim Begufoi, and the Rambam specifies Bikur Cholim, Hachnasas Orchim, Levoyes Ameis, Nichum Avelem, Simchas Chosim Vekala. All these mitzvahs are medivrei soifrim. They are mitzvahs that are bonan, but they are all included in V'yohavto l'reacho kamoicho. And all the commentators of the Rambam ask, this seems to be an internal contradiction. The Rambam says they're mitzvahs that are bonon. On the other hand, the Rambam says they're all included in V'yohavto l'reacho kamoicho. V'yohavto l'reacho kamoicho is a mitzvah d'oraisa. So why are these mitzvahs midarabonon? So I explained many times, it is what we define in the Lomdische Sprach, a mitzvah d'Rabbanan sheyesh lo ikar min haTorah. And I will explain a very simple concept. The fundamental teaching of this Rambam is, v'yohavto l'reacho kamoicho is not just about your emotions, your attitudes, and your feelings. V'yohavto l'reacho kamoicho is about your acts and your deeds. the way you act and interact and react with other people. V'yahavtu kamecho is make people happy. Go out of your way to be helpful to others. That is v'yahavtu kamecho. And Chazal say, how? And Chazal say you should engage in Masem Tovim, Bikur Cholim, Nichum Avelem, Hachnasas Orchim. These are mitzvahs medivrei sofrim. But when you engage in any of these deeds, you are mekayim v'yahavtu kamecho. If you abstain from these mitzvahs, you're not mevatel a mitzvah d'oraisa. You're mevatel a mitzvah d'rabbanan. So how could it be when I do, I have a mitzvah d'oraisa, and when I don't, I'm not over on d'oraisa? The answer is very simple. There are 1,000 ways to be helpful and make people happy. So Ploini Almoini is not Bikur Cholim, he's not Menachem Avelem, he's not a Hachnasas, but every day of Chamsin, he stands on the corner of his block with a big jerrycan of cold lemonade, and he offers cold drinks to all the passerbys. He's Mekayim v'yahavtu kamecho. It's not in the list of Gemilas Chasod Megufoy. It's not what Chazal suggested, but it definitely is a mitzvah d'oraisa v'yahavtu kamecho, because v'yahavtu kamecho means be helpful, make people happy. So Chazal say, this is what we demand. Bikur Cholim, Nichum Avelem, Hachnasas Orchim. And when you do engage in any of these acts, that is a manifestation, an expression of v'yahavtu kamecho. You are mekayim a mitzvah d'oraisa. But if you abstain from any of these acts, you're mevatel a chiyuv d'rabbanon, but you're not necessarily mevatel a mitzvah d'oraisa, because you could still be mekayim the mitzvah of v'yahavtu kamecho in many other ways. I'll give you another example. The Rambam and the Ramban have a big machlokes, very well known, and obviously there's a machlokes between the Machaba and the Ramah, but it's not the central topic we deal with today, so I'm just mentioning it l'saberes uoizen, just to give you a better understanding. The Rambam maintains that tefillah is a mitzvah d'oraisa. The very first halacha in Hilchas Tefillah, mitzvahs asay, men haTorah, sheyispalel odem b'kol yom. The Ramban argues it's a mitzvah d'rabbanan, not a mitzvah d'oraisa. What is the source of this argument? It's a Gemara Tanas the Beis Medala. Va'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. And the Gemara says, Eizu hi avodah shebeleiv zu tefillah. And the Rambam takes this drasha as a definitive drasha. We have a mitzvah, Va'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. It's in Kriya Shema. And Chazal's interpretation, what does Aveida mean? La'ovda b'chol avavchem. Eizu avodah shebeleiv zu tefillah. So the Rambam paskins tefillah is a mitzvah shel d'oraisa. The Ramban says no, tefillah is the Rabbanon. So how is the Ramban explained? Va'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. The Ramban says Va'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem is a mitzvah klolos. Whatever you do should be l'shem shemayim. It is not one specific mitzvah. It is 300 mitzvahs, or ramach mitzvahs asay. Every mitzvah you perform should be with proper kavanah, l'shem shemayim, with no ulterior motives, with no other kavanah, l'shem shemayim, lasas nachas ruach l'kodesh baruch. That is va'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. And both the Ramban and the Rambam agree as a fundamental principle in Sefer HaMitzvahs that the mitzvahs klolios are not part of the list. Because many, many times, again and again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu please, begs, commands, keep my Torah. So the general mitzvahs, which include many mitzvahs, are not in the list of Taryag. Taryag are specifics. And therefore the Ramban argues, Tefillah is not min haTorah because the Posuk V'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem is a more broad mitzvah. And it means many things, not only one mitzvah. The entirety of your avodas Hashem should be in a proper fashion. B'kavona ru'uya, with proper kavona. Reb Chaim Brisker, Perik Daled in Hilchas Tefillah writes, even according to the Ramban, Chiyuv Tefillah is midrabanon, aval kiyumo v'inyono min haTorah. And I explained, could the Ramban ignore a Gemara la'ovda b'chol avavchem eiz avodah shebelev zi tefillah? The Ramban can't ignore the Gemara. But the Ramban maintains, V'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem is somewhat similar to V'ahavto l'reacho kemoicho. It is a broad-based mitzvah. It means many things. But one of the most important things it means is tefillah. Because after all, Eiz avodah shebelev zu tefillah. So tefillah is not a specific mitzvah, which means when you daven, you are mekayim a mitzvah d'oraisa v'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. If you don't daven, you're not necessarily mevatel a mitzvah because you still have 100 other ways to be mekayim the mitzvah of avodas Hashem. So these two mitzvahs, the way I see it, v'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem according to the Ramban, v'yahavtu l'reacho kamoicho according to the Rambam, are the same. This is Rambam, this is the Ramban. But the fundamental principles in both cases is exactly the same. V'yahavtu l'reacho kamoicho means many things. And you're mekayim a mitzvah d'oraisa, which each of them, if you abstain from one of them, you're not mevatel a mitzvah d'oraisa as long as you're mekayim this mitzvah in different ways. So when you do, you have a mitzvah d'oraisa. When you don't, you're mevatel a mitzvah d'rabbanan, not a mitzvah d'oraisa. And according to the Ramban, it's the same with ve'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. The Rambam says ve'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem means tefillah. The Ramban says it means more than tefillah. It means avodas ukel. It means avodas Hashem. But one of the most important fundamentals of avodas Hashem is definitely tefillah. How you can never come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu than talking with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, please, talk to me, and I will listen. So when you daven, the Ramban would agree. You're mekayim a mitzvah of avadetem es Hashem Elokecho, but it's not a chiyuv. Because if you don't daven, you still have so many other different ways to be mekayim the mitzvah of avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. So let's get back to the point regarding what is the source of the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. So we have a few different Gemaras, but those are only asmachtas and remes. Bikur Cholim is a mitzvah of v'yohavto l'reacho kamoicho. And the same to Hachnasas, which is sugya number 2 we will be discussing shortly. Both of these mitzvahs are a manifestation, an expression of v'yahavto l'reacho kamoicho, like the Rambam explains. But the specifics are derabbanan. It's a chiyuv derabbanan to engage in Hachnasas, in Bikur Cholim, in nichum avelem, in levoyas ameis, in simchas chosan v'kala. And when you do any of these deeds, you're mekayim mitzvah d'oraisa. But if you abstain from any of them, you're not mevatel, you're not over on d'oraisa, you're over on a derabbanan, because you still have many different ways to be mekayim the mitzvah.
What about the mitzvah of Yiras Hashem, which is also the Weiss and the Rambam, and Avas Hashem? It's also a very general mitzvah. So how
Those are mitzvahs, there are shesh mitzvahs tmidiyos. And this is a separate category. Yiras Hashem, Avas Hashem, Emunas HaYichud, these are mitzvahs which are mitzvahs shebelev. Unlike v'yohavtu l'reach kamoicho, unlike v'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. V'avadetem Hashem Elokeichem, v'yohavtu l'reach kamoicho, the two mitzvahs we discussed are acting out, and it's not just about attitudes and feelings. Yiras Hashem is a mitzvah shebelev, and that is why it is defined as a mitzvah temidis, which means I believe in something even when I do not think about it. I fear something even though when I'm engaged in different things. So Avas Hashem, Yiras Hashem, Emunas HaYichud are mitzvahs temidiyos. They are not of the same nature as the two mitzvahs v'yahavtu l'reach kamoicho on one hand and v'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem on the other.
if someone refrains from making an Vayeira, isn't he mekayim in that moment the mitzvah of Yiras Hashem?
Maybe, probably yes. But Yiras Hashem, the Ramban in Parshas Yisroi has a very fundamental idea, and the Ramban comes to explain the halach of asay doicha lo ta'aseh. It's a gzeres hakosav, like the Gemara makes it clear in Yevamos Zayin. Lo tasa chomer tvei mitzvahs asay, but nevertheless, asay derech alois asay. And the Ramban Parshas Yisro explains why. So once again, when we ask why, it's tamei ha-mitzvahs. But the Ramban ala Torah many times engages in tamei mitzvahs, and the Ramban explains. All the mitzvahs asay are a manifestation and expression of ahava. Mitzvahs lois asay are an expression of yira. When you fear your master, your king, you don't want to be on the wrong side with him. You don't want to aggravate him. You just stay away. So fundamentally, all the lavim, Sheval Tas, is we don't want to aggravate the Kodesh Baruch Hu, Lock yourself up in a corner. Mitzvahs to say, when you love someone, you want to make him happy. So you go out of your way, b'kum v'asei. So the Ramban explains, all the mitzvahs to say are noiveya, stem from Ahavas Hashem. It is kum v'asei. We want to make a Kodesh Baruch Hu happy. We want to do a nachas ruach Kodesh Baruch Hu. So we do this and we do that. We say Krishma, we daven, we say Me'er Brochas B'Kol Yom, we put on tzitzis and tefillin, and those are a manifestation of Ahava. We refrain from doing bad things, that is Yira. So that accentuates your point. When you abstain from doing an Vayeira, that's an expression of Yira. Every mitzvah you perform is an expression of Ahava. But still, Ahava and Yira are defined as mitzvahs tamidiyos. And you're mekayim these mitzvahs even though you're not engaged in anything. What is Bikur Cholim about? So up to this point, I gave an important introduction to the entire realm of mitzvahs shebenodem l'chaveiroi, the mitzvahs that Chazal define gemilas chesodem not b'mamoin, but mitzvahs gemilas chesodem b'guf. It's not about your money or possession, but about your actions. And that's gemilas chesodem. And it's on one hand the Uraisa, but as specific deeds, they are midarabana. So what is Bikur Cholim all about? The tour, Shin Lamed Vav, based on the Ramban and Torah Sa'odam, right? How important Bikur Cholim is. Shemetoch kach hu mispalel olav. When you visit a person that's ill, and you see his pain, you feel his pain, you daven for him, and you also want to ask, how could I be helpful? Do you have enough food? Do you have difficulty getting a minyan to daven with you? Is there anything I could do to make things easier or more comfortable? So the Ramban, followed by the Tur, explains the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim being helpful. In Ruchnius, davening for the Cholim, and in a practical way, try to be helpful. And the Beis Yosef writes, if you were mevakeh cholim and you didn't daven for him, lo kiyah mitzvah zu, you weren't mekayim the mitzvah. Most people, when you do Bikur Cholim, neither do you ask or you care how to be helpful, neither do you daven. And the Beis Yosef writes, lo kiyah mitzvah zu. Does that mean we're wasting our time? I drove 2.5 hours to visit someone. I could daven at home. Obviously, what the Ramban and the Torah means, you could daven at home, but when you visit a person and you see him suffer, you'll daven better, you'll daven more, you'll daven on the spot. But most people don't do that. And the Beis Yosef writes, if you're mevakeh, you did daven lo kiyam es a mitzvah, which seems to be a big chiddush. Why not? Is the mitzvah tefillah? Well, a few moments ago, we discussed the machlokes, the Rambam and Ramban, whether tefillah is a Torah or not. So, would Bikur Cholim be actually tefillah? The lashon of the Ramban and the Torah is metoich kach, mispalel olav, but that doesn't seem to be the essence of the mitzvah. Bikur in Lashon Kodesh doesn't mean to visit. In modern Hebrew, levaker means to visit. But in Lashon Kodesh, levaker is to examine. When you bring a korban tzibur, you need bikur, Daled Yomim. You need to examine the animal 4 days before your makriv according to examine that it doesn't have a mum, that has no blemish. So Bikur Cholim, the way we interpret Bikur Cholim in the modern world is go visit him. But Bikur doesn't mean to visit. It means to examine, to check. So Bikur Cholim means check him out and see whether you could be helpful, whether he needs something. And that is essentially what the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim is about. The Chofetz Chaim in Avos Chesed, and Avos Chesed is one of the amazing songs of the Chofetz Chaim, all about Chesed. So many times I explain what was unique about the Chofetz Chaim. There were many Gedolim in his time, and many Tzaddikim in his time. What was unique about the Chofetz Chaim? Whatever he did in his life, he only did because he was convinced it's Tzorech Hasho, it's Tikkun Hador. So we don't have any Sforim and Shas from the Chofetz Chaim. Because the Chofetz Chaim thought to himself, there are so many Sforim of Shas. Do we really need one more? There's the Pnei Yeshua and this V'semes and the Chsam Sofer and the Meshor and the Meram, so many Sforim. The Chofetz Chaim, whatever he did during his lifetime, he did because he was thoroughly convinced this is what Klal Yisrael needs. And he writes it in his introduction to the Mishnah Berurah. The very first volume he printed was not Chelik Aleph or Chelik Beis, but Hilchos Shabbos. And he writes, without knowing Hilchos Shabbos, you can't keep Shabbos, and this is so important. He wrote Avos Chesed because he saw that people aren't diligent enough and they don't appreciate enough the mitzvah of tzedakah. He wrote a sefer Machne Yisrael for young Jewish boys that were dragged into the Russian army in the period which is called the Kantonistim, and the Russians didn't care much about their mitzvahs, and the Chofetz Chaim wrote an entire sefer instructing Jewish youngsters in the Russian or the Polish armies how to keep Shabbos and what to do about kashrus, and he wrote an entire sefer. So one of the amazing sforim of the Chofetz Chaim is Avos Chesed about tzedakah and Gimel Sodim, and the Chofetz Chaim, when he speaks about Bikur Cholim, he writes, if you didn't daven, lo kiyem et mitzvah kedin. Obviously, he was troubled with the B'si Yosef writing, lo kiyem et mitzvah. Of course, I was mekayim the mitzvah, because Chazal don't say you need to daven. And when HaKadosh Baruch Hu came to visit Avraham Avinu, did HaKadosh Baruch Hu daven for Avraham Avinu? HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't need to daven, and we all daven to him. So the Chofetz Chaim writes, based on the Ramban, lo kiyem et mitzvah k'ra'ui, lo kiyem et mitzvah kedin. So next time you go to Bikur Cholim, daven. Daven while you're there, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should send a refuah shalema. So we live in an age of plenty. And most people that are ill have families to care for them. They have medical attention. And in most cases, there really is no need. But still, you know, whenever I'm a Bikur Cholim, I always say, if there's anything I could do for you, let me know. But so Bikur Cholim is about caring, addressing the needs of the Cholim. And in most cases, that isn't very relevant because the person has family, he has friends to care for him. But you could always daven for a choila, and it is also about making a choila happy. And if you're coming to visit makes him happy, that is part of the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. Is there a mitzvah to visit a person that is unconscious or in a coma, and he's not aware that we have come? So most people would stay away. He won't know that we came anyway, and that's a mistake. Because if Bikur Cholim is about davening for a person, and you visit a person that is in such a tough place, then probably you will be kind of the mitzvah even better. And you see what dire straits he's in, and you will, you know, if he's happy and engaging and you're going to have a wonderful shmooze with him, you probably won't daven. But if you come to visit a choila that is not there and you see what a terrible shape he's in, you'll daven. And that's the real mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. And you could ask his family, is there anything we need to do? Could we be helpful in any way? Sometimes we need to talk to a doctor and we have more influence on the medical staff. So it is a mistake if we stay away from a choile, he might not be aware that we came to visit, but that doesn't make a difference. You visit a choile because you want to care for him and address his needs, and primarily davening, because tefillah is one of the most important things. Bikur Cholim, how do we define a choile that it's a mitzvah to visit? So the Maral and Gur Aryeh, in the beginning of this parsha, has an amazing chiddush. Rashi writes, and it's based on the Medish, it was shlishi limilosoi. Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu wait for day number 3? Ziz magdim and mitzvahs. So why didn't he come day number 1? So maybe he didn't have time till day number 3. Kadosh Baruch Hu always has time. He always has time. And he's never very busy with other things. So the Maral writes, Shlishi Lemila is the most difficult day. Behiyoisam koyavim, and it is that day that he is choyle kol gufoi, which is an amazing chiddush. How do we define a choyle she'ein b'skona in Hilchos Shabbos? Because in Hilchos Shabbos there are 3 different levels. Choyle she'esh b'skona, you do whatever it takes. You're over on a malacha diuraisa, choyle she'esh b'koach nefesh. Choyle she'ein b'skona, Chazal were matter administering medicine. There is no gzeira shchikas amamonim, and there were matter amira renochi. And then we have mechush. Mechush ba'alma, there is no heter. You can't even take medicine. How do we define chodesh she'ein b'sakona? The Mechaber says, nofan lemishkav. The Ramah says, choyle kol gufoi. And I wrote in my tshuvas, I don't think it's a machlokas the Mechaber in the Ramah. Mar omer chodeva lo pligi. The Shulchan Aruch writes nofal lemishkav, which means he fell into bed. Falling into bed is a very relative concept. Some people feel more comfortable horizontal than vertical. And just give them a reason and they will be in bed all their lives. You know, it's their favorite position. Other people are hyperactive. He's going to be running around and busy at home fixing things, and he can't be in bed. So nofal mishkav is a relative concept. It depends on who you are. So the Ramah writes, Chola kol gufa. Chola kol gufa means a general feeling of malaise, a general feeling of sick. When you have a high fever, when you have the flu, it's not that this hurts and that hurts. Everything hurts. So chola kol gufa is the equivalent of nofal mishkav. When you feel really sick, you stay at home. You're in bed, which doesn't mean you need to be in bed 24 hours. So I think the Ramah and the Mechaber have the same interpretation, they just use different words and a different expression. So the Maral writes, Shlishi lemila is nofal mishkav, and he seems to indicate there is no mitzvah of Bikur Cholim if a person just has a mechush. The Bikur Cholim is nofal mishkav. So this is a general question. The definition of a nofal mishkav and chola kol gufoi we only find in Hilchos Shabbos. Shin Chav Ches Sif Yud Zayim. But the concept of a choila we find in various other sugis and halachas, not only in Hilchos Shabbos. In your Deiri's halacha, chodesh yesh b'sekona is permitted to eat macholas asuras derabanan. Tov Kuf Nun Daled in Hilchos Tisha B'Av chodesh she'ein b'sekona is exempt from fast days. So how do we define chodesh she'ein b'sekona regarding fast days, regarding macholas asuras derabanan, regarding Bikur Cholim? Is it the same definition, nofal mishkav v'chola kol gufoi, or would we say every different halacha has a different interpretation, a different definition? Who is a choila? So the Maral seems to indicate shlishi lemila is nofal mishkav. So before shlishi lemila, there was no mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. That's a tremendous chiddush. And I think the definition of a choila regarding Bikur Cholim is different than the 3 other halachas. Shabbos, Tanis, Kufnun Zayin Yuradeya, the common denominator, the Tzad from these three things were Mater Isurim, were Mater Amira Enochi, were Mater Machor Sus Derabonon, were Mater breaking a fast day. So it is reasonable to assume that regarding these three halachas, the definition of a Chol She'en B'Skona would be the same, even though we do not find this Agdora only in Hilchos Shabbos. But Bikur Cholim is a mitzvah of a totally different nature. We're not dealing with Dechuyo or Hutro. We're not dealing with violating certain asurim that are bonum for the benefit of the choyle. It's just a mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. And therefore, I think, Hanachle b'nei Yisraelim lo neviim b'nei neviim. If a person isn't feeling well, and maybe you could help him, his matzav is a matzav which would require davening for him. But if a person is well, he just, he had a tooth pulled out, and he's in pain. I don't think there's a mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. So the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim depends on the two yesoidis that the Tur and the Ramban write. Tefillah, and maybe he is in need. He's in bed, he's suffering, maybe you could be helpful, you need to daven for him. So if a person is well, he just has some minor thing and he's staying at home, I don't think of those situations. But on the other hand, I do not think it depends on Nofal Mishkav or Chol Kol Gufoi. This is a definition we only find in Hilchos Shabbos, and maybe the same would apply to the other two halachas, because in a way they're similar to Hilchos Shabbos, where a matter various different isurim derabanan to be helpful for a choyle she'en b'sekona. Bikur Cholim is a totally different realm and of a totally different nature. Let's go over to Hachnasas Orchim. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, and Avraham Avinu apologized to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's amazing. And he says, Rabbeinu Shalom, could you please patiently wait a few minutes, because I have guests and I want to take care. And the guests didn't even knock on the door. Vayoretz Avraham lekrosam. Avraham Avinu runs out to bring them into his home. So there are various different halachas that we learn from Avraham Avinu. Rabbeinu Yonah in Sefer Vayeira writes, we learn from Avraham Avinu that it is a mitzvah to be engaged begufoi. Like the Gemara says in Kedushim Amalef, mitzvah bo yosem begufoi. Avraham was a wealthy person. And Anshe Beis Avraham, and Sarah was doing okay, but Avraham Avinu himself sits outside b'shlishi lemila b'choyim hayoim, and he sees three gentlemen v'yoretz lekrosam. So Rabbeinu Yonah says, Hachnasas Orchim and other mitzvahs of Gemilas Chodim should be begufoi. Don't send others. Be engaged. Do it personally. Do it yourself. Rabbeinu Bachya in Kada Kemach says, Hachnasas Orchim is not only if guests came, look for them, like Avraham Avinu did. V'yoretz lekrosam. They didn't knock on his door. They didn't call. Avraham Avinu saw them and he ran out to invite them into his home. So the Rishonim, Rabbeinu Bachya on one hand, Rabbeinu Yonah on the other hand, learn from Avraham Avinu's story in this week's Parsha, various different halachas and aspects about Bikur Cholim. And the Chofetz Chaim and Avos Chesed as a list of halachas that we would learn from Avraham Avinu in this week's Parsha. He was ill, he was sick, and he made such an effort for Hachnasas Orchim. The Mishnah Berurah Reish Ayin Aleph. Could I have Chelik Gimel Mishnah Berurah? Does anybody know where Mishnah Berurah is in this shul? So Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel Hilchos Shabbos Reish Ayin Aleph are the dinam of Kiddush. And the Mechaber writes, when a person comes home from shul, Yemaher miyad lasois Kiddush. We have a dilemma in our shul. Recently, we have Oves Abonim, and it's amazing. So all summer, first half hour after davening, Shabbos morning, after we finish davening, people, fathers, learn with children Oves Abonim. Well, my children are all grown-ups, but in this summer, it was such a pleasure to me. I had so much nachas. Every Shabbos I learned with other Einiklach. after davening. But now Shabbos has become a very short day. So we're contemplating maybe make the Ovis Abonim Leil Shabbos, which is a long Leil Shabbos. But L'chod it goes against the first Sif and Reish Ayin Aleph. Kishi Yavei Lebeso Yemaher Lechoil Miyad. So I argue Kishi Yavei Lebeso, but as long as you're in shul, you could still Loi Ba Lebeso. But the Mechaber means to say, you finish davening, Yavei Lebeso V'Yemaher Lechoil Miyad. The Mishnah Berurah writes, Hainu lekadish, kedei sheyizker Shabbos betchilas knisasoi. So, Yemaher lechol miyad. The Dvar of Rom, the covenant of, in his Tshuvos, Chelik Beis, Siman Aleph, I heard in the name of Agon, Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKoyen Meradin, that if you have guests Leil Shabbos, then you shouldn't sing Zmiras because you're over on Balta Achar. If your guests are hungry, if there's a Oni Lefonov, it's Balta Achar. You need to give him tzedukah right away. So I heard in the name of the Chofetz Chaim that he paskined that if you have guests, you don't say the Zmiras, because you're over on Balta Achar. And the Dvar of Ram says, it's not the minig oilam. So he argues, because the minig is to say Zmiris, Shalom Aleichem, Eishes Chayel, we Chassidim also have quite a lengthy tefillah, Rabbeinu Shaloilam, and Askini Sedosa, which the Ariya Kodesh composed. I looked at my watch a few times. How long does it take me, this entire ceremony from Shalom Aleichem to Kiddush? It's about 6 or 7 minutes. It's not very long, but when you're hungry sometimes, especially for kids, it is long. So the Dvar of Ram writes, when a person takes upon himself to give tzedukah ad yom ploini, then he has time ad yom ploini. And in that case, it's not baltacha. And because the minig is to say Zmiris, there is no Balta Achar. The Mishnah Berurah here on the Mechaber, when the Mechaber says miyad, you're allowed to say Kriya Shema earlier. And in Bialocha, he has a lengthy discussion. So is that right? What the Dvar Avram quotes? I heard that this is Psak of the Mishnah Berurah. Maserav. One of my wonderful sons-in-law is Arav Rabbeinu Rosenbaum. Maybe some of you know him. He's my right-hand man. If anybody is looking for a Minchas Osher, I'm not the address. He is. Rabbi knows Bainish. He's an amazing young man. He's an Ur-Einikel, a great-grandson of the Pittsburgh Rav, who was Rabbi Avram Binyamin Zilberberg. And he had a kil in Pittsburgh. And he, from America, visited Lithuania, and he was Leil Shabbos in the home of the Chofetz Chaim. Chofetz Chaim came home from shul, and he made Kiddush right away. And the Pittsburgh Rav was a Ger Chassid, so he was somewhat taken aback. After the Chofetz Chaim made Kiddush, he had the chutzpah to ask the Chofetz Chaim, your minig, you don't say Shalom Aleichem, you don't greet the Malachim that come to your home B'Leil Shabbos. And the Chofetz Chaim said, the Malachim aren't hungry. And they will patiently wait. But I assume that you are hungry, so when I have guests, I welcome the Malachim after we wash. That's what the Chofetz Chaim said. And after Kiddush, and they washed, and after B'tzias Abbas, the Chofetz Chaim went back to say Shalom Aleichem, and whatever Zmiris he said, I don't know what he did say, what he didn't say. I would be surprised if he said Askinas Adoso, but he definitely said Shalom Aleichem and Eishes Chayil. So that's a story which in my son-in-law's family, is part of their family heritage. And the Chofetz Chaim didn't say it's an Vayeira, it's balta'achar, but he said with a touch of humor, the Malachim are patient, they're not hungry, they will patiently wait, but when I have guests, I make Kiddush, and first we wash, and then I would say the various midas that our minhag is to say. So it's not an Vayeira, but it might be the right thing. Hachnasas Orchim is a doicha Talmud Torah, or it's not doicha Talmud Torah. So the Gemara says in Masechet Shabbos, we started the Shiur, Gedoyle Hachnasas Orchim kashkumas beis hamedrash. And then the Gemara says, Gedoyle Hachnasas Orchim yoisem mekabolas ben Shechina, because the Kodesh Baruch Hu comes to visit Avraham Avinu, and Avraham Avinu is engaged in Hachnasas Orchim. So if we say, Gedoyle Hachnasas Orchim yoisa mashkumas beis hamedrash, do you need to be mevatel Torah for Hachnasas Orchim? Or would we say, it's a mitzvah she'efshar la'asos al yedei acherim. But kol mitzvah she'efshar la'asos al yedei acherim is not doicha Talmud Torah. So if there's nobody else to care for the guests, it's definitely doicha Talmud Torah. Like every mitzvah she'efshar la'asos al yedei acherim. But if there's no one else to care for your guests, you close your Gemara and you need to engage in the mitzvah of Hachnasas Orchim. But on the other hand, if it's Gedoyle Hachnasas Orchim, Yoisem Hashkumas Beis HaMedrash, would it override the Shkumas Beis HaMedrash? Not necessarily. In Megillah Tav Tezvav, there's a Gemara, Gedoyle Talmud Torah Yoisem Atzolas Nefoshes. Gedoyle Talmud Torah Yoisem Atzolas Nefoshes. Does that mean you're learning Daf Yomi, and one of the people, Lo Aleinu, collapses? It might be cardiac arrest. You don't know what it is. Do you call that Sola? The Maggid Shia says, we're almost finished with the daf. It'll take another 10 minutes. If he'll still be alive, we'll call Hatzola. But right now, Gedoyle Talmud Torah Yoisem Hatzolas Nefoshes. The Turazov in Simulation Nun Aleph has a discussion with the psak of the Drisha. The Drisha says, if we have a mitzvah of Pidyon Shavuyim, and a Shechanoch, Pidyon Shavuyim is defined as Pikuach Nefesh, once upon a time, and even today in many places in the world, if a Jew is in jail, his life is in terrible sakana. Even today, and even in the modern world. So the Drisha says, if the only source for funds for Pidyon Shavuyim is the cheder or the koilel, you can't touch that money. Because Gedoyle Talmud Torah Yoisem Atzolas Nefoshes. And you cannot touch money that is designated for Talmud Torah. So the Taz disagrees with the Drisha. And the Taz asks exactly the question I asked. Gedoyle Talmud Torah Yoisem Atzolas Nefoshes. That means you're going to let a person die because you're learning? No. Gedoyle Talmud Torah Yoisem Atzolas Nefoshes doesn't mean that Talmud Torah overrides Atzolas Nefoshes. Nothing overrides Atzolas Nefoshes besides Gili Aroyes, Svichas Domem, and Avodah Zorah. What the Gemara means to say, when you learn Torah, you need to be so appreciative. What you're doing is more important than Atzolas Nefoshes. Two brothers. One is a Lamdin, he learns Yom V'Layla. His brother volunteers for Atzola. They're both amazing, they're both doing great. But the one that dedicates his life for Talmud Torah is greater than the one dedicating his life for Atzolas Nefoshes. And I don't mean to belittle in any way the wonderful people that volunteer to Atzola or to Mada, they save lives. But the Taz just means to explain. When Chazal say, this is greater than that, doesn't mean that this overrides that. So when Chazal say, Gedoyle Talmud Torah Yoisem Atzolas Nefoshes, it doesn't mean that Talmud Torah overrides Atzolas Nefoshes. No. Just like you slam Gemara Shat and try to save a life, we take money out of the Kupas HaKoilel for Pidyon Shavuyim. But the schus of Talmud Torah is a greater schus. And it goes the same regarding Hachnasas Orchim and Hashkumas Beis HaMedrash. Gedoyle Hachnasas Orchim Yoisem Hashkumas Beis HaMedrash. However, The fundamental rules are the same. Mitzvah she'efshar la'asos al-yedei acherim is not doichet Talmud Torah. I'efshar la'asos al-yedei acherim, doichet Talmud Torah. The Aderes was an amazing gadol, and he wrote so many svarim. And one of his svarim is Over Oilach Siman Samach Det. He tells a story. My minig was Friday in the morning to read the Parsha Shnaya Mikro Ve'echo Targum while I'm dressed in talis and tefillin from a Sefer Torah. That was his minig. Do you have a heter to take out the Sefer Torah because of a frumkeit? You want to say Shnaya Mikro Echo Targum from a Sefer Torah? No. But his rationale was, every week I want to check the Sefer Torah that there are no ta'usim, there are no mistakes. So I might as well read Shnai Mikra Vechatagim. So his minig was Friday morning, while he's still in talis and tefillin, he took out the Sefer Torah and he read the Vokadika Parsha. He went over the Parsha to see that there are no mistakes in the Sefer Torah. And he tells a story, somebody came to visit, but he didn't want to be mafsik. So it was a Choshev Talmud Chochem. He had him wait till he ended reading the Parsha. And then he writes, I had terrible regrets because Gedoy Hachnasas Orchim Yoisa Mashkomes Beis HaMedrash. On the other hand, I wasn't mevatel Hachnasas Orchim. You know, other people took care of him. I was just, misakev. But then he writes, maybe the reason that mitzvah she'efshar la'asos al-yedei acherim is not doichet Talmud Torah because Talmud Torah, you're always mechuyev. But my minig is limited in time. So maybe it is different. Maybe I should have stopped. To the contrary, maybe I did have a heter to finish because I know this will take another 15 minutes and I'm finished reading the parsha and then I'll take care of him. But by Talmud Torah, you're never finished. That is why you need to stop in the middle and care for a noirech. But if I know that I'm just engaged in reading the parsha, so this is an interesting discussion regarding the dilemma when Hachnasas Orchim comes against Talmud Torah. So today we discussed, first of all, the general concept of mitzvah sheben odam l'chaveiroi, gemilas chasodim begufoi, not the mitzvah sheben odam l'chaveiroi part of the Taryag, but gemilas chasodim begufoi. Hachnasas Orchim, levoyas ameis, simchas chosam vekala, Bikur Cholim, nichum avelim. All these belong to the category of gemilas chasodim begufoi. So we find two droshes in Chazal defining the posuk of Achrei Hashem Elokeichem Telechun and the mitzvah of Zakeli Va'anveyu. And these two droshes seem to be the same. Soiti Udalad. And at the beginning of the Shiur I quoted the Gemara. אחרי השם לקחם תלכו, וכי אפשר ללכת אחריו, השם לקחו איש אויכה לו, הלך בדרוכיו, הוא מבקר חוילם, אף אתו בקר חוילם. הוא מלבש הרומים, אף אתו הלבש הרומים. שבס קל"ג זה כאילו, והביאו הווי דומה לו. מהו רחום, אף אתו רחום, מהו חנון, אף אתו חנון. Are these the same rule? The same teaching? Not the same loshon? And Chazal interpret two different psukim, can be the same. I think they are similar, but not identical. They're not the same. Two sides of the same coin. On one hand, Zakeli va'anveyu haveido melo. Rashi explains, va'anveyu is an abbreviation of two words, ani v'hu, I and him. In what way? Haveido melo. Ma'urachum afaturachum. Chlem Hashem lekechu telechu. Go in his ways. Sometimes you get to know people, wonderful people, caring people, loving people, people of compassion, but for some reason they're not engaged in gemilas chasodim. And it might be for many reasons. Some people love others, but they love themselves far more. And they're still busy caring for themselves that they didn't get around yet to care for others. There are many reasons. One person might be a huge masmid, and he thinks he learns all day, so he's potter from Gemilas Chasadim. So there are people that are wonderful people, but they're not engaged in Gemilas Chasadim. On the other hand, sometimes you get to know people. This one runs a gemach, that one collects money, and this one is a yoetz nisuin. They're engaged in masim tovim. But when you get to know them on a personal level, they're not good people. They don't really care about others. So why are they engaged in chesed if they don't care? Worst case scenario, covet, money, status. Best case scenario, they know it's a huge mitzvah. And the kavanah is l'shem shemayim. But both are lacking. On one hand, how could one be like a Kodesh Baruch Hu? Hu rachum afatu rachum. Hu chanun afatu chanun. Kodesh Baruch Hu expects us to be like him. He's caring, he's compassionate. He cares about others. He feels the pain of others. But that is not enough. Achrei Hashem elokechu telechu alecha b'drochav. Hu goyim el dalem, afatu goyim el dalem. Hu mavaka cholim, afatu baka cholim. You need to care, and you need to express that compassion. And you need to engage. And you need to be helpful. So these two Gemaras are two sides of the same coin. And the shleimus of a person is only with a combination of both. It's not enough to be engaged, you need to care. It's not enough to care, you need to be engaged. And it is one of the things we learn from Avraham Avinu, his caring and his mesirus nefesh, while he was in terrible pain and suffering, a 99-year-old person after surgical procedure, and there was no anesthesiologist around when Avraham Avinu did Mila. And so we learn about his mesirus nefesh for Hachnasas Orchim. And the Mishnah says in Masechet Tzavos, Eizu talmidov shel Avraham Avinu, kol sheyesh bo ayin toivo, ruach namucha, nefesh velo, midas shebenodem lechaveiroi. And who are the talmidim of Bilam? Kol sheyesh bo ayin ra, nefesh lechava, ruach gavoya. So what symbolizes the others more than anything else was their midas. And not only their dveikus in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is what we discussed today, the Hachnasas Orchim of Avraham Avinu, and the Bikur Cholim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the entire realm of midas toivus and gemilas chasadim begufoy. Reb Chaim Vital, in his Sefer Shari Kedusha, explains, if midas toivus are so essential and so important, why aren't they part of Taryag mitzvahs? And he explains, not because they're less important than Taryag mitzvahs, but rather because they are more fundamental than Taryag mitzvahs. And he gives a moshel. Person came to a contractor, and he said, I want to build a house. This is my lot, and I want a 10-story building. And, you know, they go to an adrichal and to a mandes, and he comes with a plan, 10 stories. This is the blueprint. This is the plant. It's $1 million each floor, $10 million. 2 years pass, the building, oimed litif oro, and he takes out a checkbook. He writes a $10 million check, and the contractor says, no. We said each floor is $1 million, but I also dug into the ground, and you need to pay for that extra. And the person says, you're out of your mind. I mean, if you give a plan and a price, it includes the fundament. You know, it's part of the building. Everybody knows you can't build a building without digging into the ground. So that's part of the package. It's part of the deal. So Reb Chaim Vital says, the Yesodis are the midas toivus. The mitzvahs That's the building. That's the skyscraper. Those are the mitzvahs. But you would never be successful in being kind of mitzvahs if you lack midas tovos. And the midas tovos are the fundamentals of this entire beautiful structure. So the mitzvahs aren't part of Tariq mitzvahs because they are more fundamental than the mitzvahs, not because they are less important. And that is what we learn from the Ovos Hekdoshim and from Avraham Avinu. Ayin toivo, ruach namucha, nefesh shvela, and his mesiras nefesh, and his compassion in caring for others, as expressed in the mitzvah of Hachnasas Orchim. Yerotzen shichel kenu amorim. Beglalovais Toshia bonim v'sovi geula. We should b'korav sipanei Mashiach tzedkenu b'mheru v'yomeinu amen.